Hey Heidi, this is Jeff. How are you?
Hi, Jeff. I'm doing fine.
Great, great. I
Hanging in there.
appreciate I appreciate you connecting with me today. We're talking about bank mergers and their
Yes.
impact on the appraisal department. Let's start off with, I know, big topic, right? Let's start off with bank mergers and how does it relate to banks of different sizes?
Well, I can speak to that because the bank I started at was just pretty much concentrated in a one city when I joined them in the early 90s. And in 2011, when I left, they were 5 states. Most of that growth was by acquiring other banks, small banks. So I've been on the side of the banks acquiring small banks. And when I left, the reason I left is that we got acquired in 2011. So I've seen it all. And I do think that it's different for the smaller banks because generally they don't have appraisers on staff. Now, that's something that's changing a little bit. I've seen some smaller banks, some community banks that have one appraiser that's doing the whole. It's a one-man show. But generally, there's non-appraisers maybe out of the credit side that are then left to say, well, what do I do? Because now a larger bank that probably has an appraisal department is taking you over. So that's a whole different metric or result for the two groups than if there are two larger size banks where there's an acquisition, like the bank that I worked at, where we had MAIs on staff and a fairly robust organization and grouping, and then the other bank also had their own appraisal department. So that's a whole different thing. Now, when we took over the smaller banks, it's also going to depend if you're taking over. If, say, I'm a small bank, and
Right.
what do I do when I'm going to be taken over or acquired? Well, it depends on what the need is. But we found that for those folks, we could train them up to do some of the smaller bidding and engagement and reviewing. So just because a small bank appraisal department individual who isn't an appraiser is in a bank that gets acquired doesn't mean that they're going to be kicked out of that appraisal function. In the event that they are, most folks that are not appraisers from the get-go had other prior experience at the bank, including things like credit analysis and credit review, so they can generally slip back in. So it's a completely different experience when you've got extent appraisal departments as opposed to folks who are doing the appraisal function without a chief appraiser and without appraisers on staff.
That makes sense. For example, in my market, Center State Bank and South State Bank are merging.
Ah,
And what advice would you give on both sides? You have two banks merging. What can the appraisal department, chief appraisers, and the team expect on both sides? Not of that particular merger, but
right.
a general merger. Let's say it's of equal or generally equal. What's the expectation of the appraisal department on the merger? Pre-merger, post-merger?
Pre-merger, there's going to be, I imagine, some vetting. It's going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend on the sizes of the bank. It's going to depend upon what kind of asset mix that each bank has, retail versus real estate secured, particularly commercial real estate secured. Those are going to come into play. The expertise of the individuals, if you've got appraisal departments, how many of the folks in each group are actually appraisers versus non-appraisers involved in that function. So all of those are going to come into play. But generally the individual that has the most exposure is the person at the top. But there's plenty of opportunity for merging of individuals that are not at the top, all of the staff reviewers and people doing the bidding, engaging, just because you're going to have, it's not like you're going to magically cut down on the number of loans you have. This bank has this many loans and this bank has that many loans. And when you put them together, you still have to service those loans. And you still have the same number of loan officers generally out there in the markets making loans that you have to process, the appraisal side of it. So don't expect necessarily that there's going to be cuts in the appraisal department. The biggest hurdle that in my experience, is corporate culture. Not necessarily that, everybody's going to be let go or not let go, but for the folks who stay there, it's going to be an uncomfortable transition, because it's going to be which culture is going to win out. And in my experience, there might be similar cultures, but everybody's going to do things a little bit different. Everybody's going to have different software. We bought little banks that had better software, better versions of Windows than we did. They had to step back in order to join our bigger organization. So those are the kinds of things that I think that you have to be dealing with. But it's not the end of the world, and there's going to be a need for the appraisal department for the larger entity, especially if there is a growth mode going on, which generally is what happens after the merger gets all solidified. They're going to want to move forward and grow more, and so you're not going to be not needed if you're working for either organization. But the corporate culture, that was the hardest thing for me. Was the bank that acquired us just did things so much differently, and I was used to a lot more latitude, a lot more the responsibility without people looking over my shoulder, and some people could make that transition okay. I wasn't one of them. So it's going to be a question too, even if there's a place for you, like there was a place for me to stay on. The reason I didn't was that it didn't just work for my personality to be in that corporate culture. So that's something that you have to think about as well.
That's a great question. You brought up growth. So if the merging banks are growing a lot, how critical do you think processes such as workflow is to that merger?
It's crucial. It's really crucial. In fact, when we bought the smaller banks and we had to take on their portfolios as well as ours, we kept some of the people on, not all of them, but we were able to absorb a lot more and grow into other markets a lot better, because we were mastering and improving our process and our workflow, and throwing them in. Besides corporate cultures, the one big problem for me that I left the bank that acquired us is because its workflow was not as nearly as good as the one that we had been working with. And in fact, that was, the genesis of the YouConnect system. Was in our bank, and that's where it was beta tested and all worked out. And so those kinds of things are key. If you can't have those efficiencies for workflow, if you're using some antiquated software, inefficient software that doesn't embed process in it, but just a place where you can put post-it notes of information, then there's a learning curve for the new folks that aren't in that software to pick it up, because it's not as intuitive. You just have to find where all those silly post-it notes are, as opposed to a workflow software that actually just kind of takes you from one spot to the other as you move through the process of the bidding and the engaging. That makes, I think, the transition, there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, but if you've got that kind of workflow, and that's the one that wins out in the merger, then it's going to lessen the growing pains or the merger pains or whatever, I think, for the individuals.
Okay, well, that's really appreciate your time, Heidi. It's very helpful. Hopefully it's been helpful to the listeners, and we'll pick this up again. Thank you for your time, Heidi.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.